All right, so picture this. It's October 1917. A farmer in Cork County, Ireland stands at the edge of his field, watching something that, well, frankly shouldn't exist yet. A small gray tractor, no bigger than a horse cart, churning through soil that would have taken him and his animals 3 days to turn. The machine weighs just 2,500 pounds, it costs $230, and it's about to make the horse obsolete. This is the Fordson Model F, and before you think this is just another story about Henry Ford inventing something clever, you need to know that this machine almost didn't happen. In fact, Ford tried to kill it twice. See, the Fordson wasn't born in Detroit. It was born in Dearborn, Michigan, in a completely separate company that Ford himself refused to attach his name to. Why? Because he was terrified, not of failure, of success. He knew that if this tractor worked, it would cannibalize his car business. Farmers would buy tractors instead of Model Ts. Dealers would revolt. Shareholders would panic. So Ford buried it. But then World War I happened, and Britain was starving. By early 1917, German U-boats were sinking cargo ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Food imports to Britain had collapsed. The government was rationing bread. There was talk, quiet, desperate talk, of surrender. Not because of military defeat, because the population couldn't eat. Britain needed to grow more food fast. But here's the problem. The men who worked the farms were gone, conscripted, shipped to France, dead in trenches. The horses that pulled the plows? Also gone, requisitioned by the military to haul artillery and supply wagons. British farms in 1917 were being worked by women, children, and old men using tools that hadn't changed since the Middle Ages. The British government sent a delegation to the United States with one mission: find a tractor. Any tractor, something cheap, simple, and mass-producible, something that could replace a horse and a man and be operated by someone who'd never touched a machine before. They visited every tractor manufacturer in America: International Harvester, J.I. Case, Rumley, Hart-Parr. All of them said the same thing. Sure, we can build you tractors. Give us 2 years, maybe 3. Oh, and they'll cost about $800 each. Britain didn't have 2 years, or $800 per unit. Then someone mentioned Henry Ford and the little gray tractor he'd been hiding in Dearborn. Now, Ford had been tinkering with tractor designs since 1895. His first prototype was essentially a Model T engine bolted to a plow frame. It was ridiculous. It tipped over, it couldn't pull anything heavier than a small cart. But Ford kept at it. By 1916, he'd built something genuinely functional: a lightweight, gasoline-powered tractor with a 4-cylinder engine, a 3-speed transmission, and a worm gear final drive. It could pull a 2-bottom plow through clay soil without breaking a sweat. 3 forward gears, 1 reverse. No cab, no fenders, no lights. Just engine, transmission, rear axle, and frame. The whole thing was built like a bridge. The engine block, transmission case, and rear axle housing were bolted together to form a single stressed structure. No separate frame. This was radical. Every other tractor on the market used a heavy steel chassis. The Fordson didn't need one. The drivetrain was the chassis. This made it light, and lightness made it cheap, and cheap made it revolutionary. The first shipment left for Britain in May 1917. By June, they were in the fields, and farmers who'd been plowing with horses for 30 years, learned to operate them in an afternoon. So here's what nobody expected. The Fordson didn't just work, it worked too well. By late 1917, Britain had taken delivery of nearly 7,000 Fordsons. They were showing up on farms across England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and the results were, well, they were impossible to ignore. A single Fordson could do the work of 6 horses. It didn't need rest, didn't need feeding, didn't get sick, didn't die. A farmer who'd been plowing 5 acres a day with a horse team could now plow 15, 20 if the soil was light.
Food production in Britain stabilized, then increased. By 1918, British farms were producing more wheat, barley, and potatoes than they had before the war, despite having lost half their workforce. But here's where it gets complicated, because back in the United States, Henry Ford had a problem. He'd built this massive tractor factory, he'd proven the design, he'd delivered thousands of units to Britain, and now he had no customers. See, American farmers in 1917 were skeptical. Tractors weren't new, they'd been around since the 1890s, but every tractor on the market was enormous, 5 tons, 10 tons, designed for massive western wheat farms. They cost $1,000 or more, they required a crew to operate, and they broke down constantly. Small farmers, the ones working 80, 100, 150 acres, couldn't afford them, didn't need them, didn't want them. The Fordson was different. It was small, it was cheap, but American farmers didn't trust small. They thought it looked fragile, thought it wouldn't have enough power, thought Ford was trying to sell them a toy. So Ford did what Ford always did when people doubted him. He took it to the field and proved them wrong. In summer 1917, Ford organized a series of public demonstrations across the Midwest, brought Fordsons to county fairs, to agricultural shows, to plowing competitions. He'd park the tractor next to a team of horses and challenge anyone to a race. Plow an acre, see who finishes first. The Fordson won every time, and it wasn't close. Farmers started paying attention. Orders began trickling in, then pouring in. By end of 1918, Ford was shipping Fordsons domestically. By early 1919, he couldn't build them fast enough. But then International Harvester noticed, and they were not happy. International Harvester at this point was the largest agricultural manufacturer in the world. They sold plows, harvesters, binders, mowers, and yes, tractors. Their Titan and Mogul tractors dominated the American market. They were big, expensive, and profitable. Harvester had spent 2 decades building a dealer network, a parts supply chain, a service infrastructure. They owned the tractor business. And now Henry Ford was showing up with a machine that cost a quarter of what theirs did, weighed a fifth as much, and was selling faster than they could count. Harvester's first response was to ignore it, then to dismiss it, then, when that didn't work, to attack it. They published articles in farm magazines claiming the Fordson was underpowered, that it would tip over, that it couldn't handle heavy work, that it would break down and leave farmers stranded. Ford responded by dropping the price. In January 1918, he cut the Fordson's retail price to $395. Then, in October, he dropped it again to $795 for the fully equipped model. Harvester panicked. They slashed prices on their own tractors. The Titan 1020, which had sold for $1,000, was suddenly $650. The Mogul 816 dropped to $475. But it didn't matter. Farmers didn't want cheap versions of old designs, they wanted the Fordson. By end of 1918, Ford had sold more than 34,000 Fordsons. In 1919, that number doubled. By 1920, Ford had captured nearly 70% of the American tractor market. Harvester's market share collapsed from 60% to less than 20%. Other manufacturers started failing. Smaller companies, ones that had been building tractors for a decade, couldn't compete. The Waterloo Gasoline Engine Company, maker of the Waterloo Boy tractor, was sold to John Deere in 1918 just to survive. The Moline Plow Company merged with 3 other firms to form Minneapolis Moline. Hart Parr, once the largest tractor manufacturer in America, was absorbed into Oliver Farm Equipment. The Fordson wasn't just winning, it was erasing the competition. But here's what's fascinating. The Fordson itself, it wasn't actually that good. Not technically. The engine was crude, cast iron block, no overhead valves, low compression. It burned fuel inefficiently. The cooling system was marginal, the tractor ran hot, especially in summer. The worm gear final drive, while strong, was also inefficient. It absorbed horsepower, generated heat, and required constant lubrication. The steering was heavy, the brakes were terrible, the seat, if you could call it that, was a flat metal pan. The controls were awkward, the clutch was stiff. Shifting gears required muscle and timing. If you missed a shift, you'd grind the gears and possibly strip them. And it was dangerous. The Fordson had a nasty habit of flipping over backwards if the plow hit a rock or a root. The rear wheels would lift, the whole machine would pivot on the drawbar, and the operator would be crushed underneath. Dozens of farmers died this way in the early years. Ford knew about this. So did everyone. But Ford didn't recall the tractors, didn't redesign them, didn't issue warnings. He just kept building them. Because the Fordson's flaws didn't matter. What mattered was the price. At $795, the Fordson wasn't a premium machine. It was a disposable one. Farmers bought them expecting them to last 5 years, maybe less. If the engine wore out, you didn't rebuild it, you traded it in and bought a new one. Ford had turned the tractor into a commodity, and in doing so, he destroyed the entire business model of every other manufacturer.
Alright, so let's talk about how this thing actually worked, because the Fordson's success wasn't just about price, it was about simplicity. And simplicity in engineering is much harder than it looks. The Fordson Model F used a 4-cylinder inline engine. Bore was 4 inches, stroke was 5 inches. Total displacement 251 cubic inches. Valve in-block design, meaning the valves sat next to the cylinders, actuated by push rods from a camshaft in the crankcase. This was old technology, even in 1917, but it was reliable and cheap to manufacture. The engine produced 20 horsepower at the drawbar, roughly 30 at the belt pulley. Now, that doesn't sound like much. A compact tractor makes twice that. But remember, a horse produces about 1 horsepower continuously. So 20 horsepower was equivalent to 20 horses. Except the Fordson didn't get tired, didn't need rest, could run 12, 14 hours straight if you kept fuel in it. Fuel capacity was 10 gallons. Consumption was roughly 2 gallons per hour under load, so a full tank gave you about 5 hours of plowing. After that, you refilled from a barrel strapped to the drawbar and kept going. Ignition was a low-tension magneto. No battery, no distributor, just a magneto driven off the timing gears. This was important. Most tractors in the 1910s used battery ignition. Batteries died, corroded, froze in winter. The magneto didn't care. As long as the engine was turning, you had spark. Starting was done with a hand crank at the front. You'd set the throttle, retard the ignition timing, and crank. If you were lucky, it fired on the second or third pull. If you weren't, you cranked for 10 minutes. In winter, you heated the engine block with a blowtorch before cranking. Otherwise, the oil was too thick and the engine wouldn't turn over. The transmission was a 3-speed sliding gear design. First gear was for plowing, pulling heavy loads through mud or clay. Second gear for lighter work, harrowing, cultivating, road travel. Third gear for belt work, running stationary equipment. Reverse was a single speed, same ratio as first gear. Shifting required double clutching. You'd pull the clutch lever, shift into neutral, release the clutch, rev the engine to match the road speed, pull the clutch again, shift into the next gear, and release. If you mistimed it, the gears wouldn't mesh. If you forced it, you'd strip the teeth. Farmers got good at it, or they broke their transmissions. The clutch itself was a wet multi-plate design running in oil. This was clever. Dry clutches burned out quickly under heavy load. Wet clutches ran cooler, lasted longer, but they also required adjustment. If the oil level dropped, the clutch would slip. If the plates wore unevenly, engagement would be grabby and violent. Power went from the transmission to the rear axle through a worm gear reduction. The worm was a spiral gear on the output side of the transmission. The wheel was a large bronze gear mounted on the differential housing. This gave a final drive ratio of about 43:1, lots of torque multiplication, but also lots of friction. Worm gears are inherently inefficient, typically 70 to 80% efficient under ideal conditions. The Fordson setup was probably closer to 65%, meaning a third of the engine's power was being converted to heat. This mattered. The rear axle housing ran hot. In summer, under heavy load, it could get hot enough to burn your hand. Ford's solution was to vent the housing and rely on airflow for cooling. It worked, barely. The rear wheels were steel, 42 inches in diameter with removable cleats. The cleats were just flat steel bars bolted to the rim. They bit into soil, provided traction, and chewed up roads. If you wanted to drive on pavement, you removed the cleats and bolted on flat rims. Most farmers didn't bother. They just drove on the cleats and destroyed the road surface. The front wheels were smaller, 28 inches, also steel. No suspension, no springs. The tractor rode directly on the wheels. Every bump, every rut, every rock transmitted straight through the frame into the operator's spine. After a full day in the seat, farmers could barely walk. Steering was manual, no power assist.
The steering wheel was connected to the front axle through a worm and sector gearbox. Turning the wheel rotated the worm, which moved the sector, which pivoted the axle. At low speeds, steering required muscle. At high speed, it required strength and timing. If the front wheels hit a rut while you were turning, the wheel would spin out of your hands and possibly break your fingers. The drawbar was mounted low, just above the rear axle. This was intentional. Low mounting point reduced the chance of the tractor flipping backwards under load, but it didn't eliminate it. If the plow hit an obstacle, the resistance would try to lift the front end. If the load was heavy enough or the hitch point high enough, the tractor would pivot. The front wheels would lift, the rear wheels would keep driving forward, and the whole machine would flip over backwards, crushing the operator. Ford eventually added a safety feature, a hinged seat that would dump the operator off the back as the tractor started to flip. It saved lives, but it also resulted in farmers being thrown off moving tractors into the path of whatever implement was being towed. So, not perfect. The Fordson had no brakes on the early models, none. Stopping required pulling the clutch and letting the tractor coast to a halt. If you were on a hill, you put it in gear and let the engine compression slow you down. If that wasn't enough, you steered into a ditch. Later models got a single rear wheel brake operated by a foot pedal. It worked, sometimes. Despite all these flaws, the Fordson was easy to maintain. The entire engine could be rebuilt with basic hand tools, a wrench set, a screwdriver, a hammer. You could pull the cylinder head, replace the gaskets, regrind the valves, and have it back together in a day. Parts were standardized, mass-produced, and cheap. A replacement piston was $2. A full engine rebuild kit was $30. This was revolutionary. Other tractors required specialized tools, factory-trained mechanics, and weeks of waiting for parts. The Fordson could be fixed by anyone who could read a manual, and Ford made sure the manuals were simple. Step-by-step instructions, clear diagrams, written for people who'd never worked on an engine before.
So by 1920, the Fordson had basically conquered America. Over 100,000 units sold. Ford's Dearborn factory was running 3 shifts, producing 300 tractors per day. Dealerships were opening in every farming town in the Midwest. International Harvester was bleeding market share. Smaller manufacturers were going bankrupt. And then Ford did something unexpected. He moved production to Ireland. Now, this wasn't just a business decision. This was personal. Henry Ford's father, William Ford, had emigrated from County Cork in the 1840s during the potato famine. Henry had never forgotten that. He saw Ireland as his ancestral home, and he saw an opportunity. In 1919, Ireland was a mess, still part of the United Kingdom, but barely. The Irish War of Independence was escalating. The economy was collapsing. Unemployment was rampant. Ford thought he could help. He'd build a factory in Cork, employ Irish workers, manufacture Fordsons for the European market, and maybe, just maybe, stabilize the region. He broke ground in 1919. The factory opened in July 1920. It was massive, purpose-built for tractor production. Integrated foundry, machine shop, assembly line. Ford transferred entire production tooling from Dearborn to Cork. By end of 1920, the Cork plant was producing 100 tractors per day. But here's the problem. Ford had miscalculated. He'd assumed European farmers were like American farmers. They weren't. European farms were smaller. Fields were irregularly shaped. Hedgerows, stone walls, narrow lanes. The Fordson, designed for wide-open Midwestern prairies, was too big, too powerful, too clumsy for European conditions. And European farmers, especially in France and Germany, preferred horses. Horses didn't require fuel, didn't need spare parts, didn't break down. Sales in Europe were disappointing. Ford responded by cutting prices again. By 1921, the Fordson was selling for $625 in the US, even less in Europe. Harvester matched, then undercut, then matched again. It became a price war. And price wars destroy profit margins. By 1922, Ford was losing money on every tractor he sold. Not a little money, a lot of money. The Dearborn factory was hemorrhaging cash. The Cork factory even worse. Ford kept both plants running anyway, because Ford didn't care about short-term profit. He cared about market share. And he was winning. By 1922, Fordson held 75% of the American tractor market. But Harvester wasn't done. They'd been working on a response, and in 1923, they released it. The Farmall. Now, the Farmall wasn't technically better than the Fordson.
It used a similar engine, similar transmission, similar final drive, but it had one critical advantage: adjustable wheel spacing. See, the Fordson and fixed wheel widths. You couldn't change them. This was fine for plowing, but terrible for cultivating. Cultivating requires driving between rows of crops without crushing them. Row widths vary. Corn, wheat, cotton, potatoes, all different. The Fordson couldn't adapt. The Farmall could. You could adjust the rear wheels to match any row width. This made it a true general-purpose tractor. Farmers noticed. Sales of the Farmall took off. By 1924, Harvester was gaining market share again. Ford's response was nothing. He didn't redesign the Fordson, didn't add adjustable wheels, didn't innovate. He just kept building the same machine year after year, cheaper and cheaper. And then, in 1928, Ford made a decision that shocked everyone. He shut down Fordson production in America. Completely. Stopped. Closed the Dearborn plant. Laid off the workers. Dismantled the tooling. Done. Why? Because Ford was obsessed with his new project, the Model A automobile. He just discontinued the Model T after nearly 20 years. The Model A was going to be bigger, better, more modern. And Ford wanted every factory, every worker, every dollar focused on it. The tractor business, despite its market dominance, was a distraction. So he killed it. In America, anyway. Production continued in Cork. The Irish factory kept building Fordsons for the European, African, and Asian markets. And interestingly, sales actually increased. Turns out, European farmers were finally coming around to tractors. The Fordson, now built locally with local support, started selling. By the early 1930s, Ford's Cork plant was profitable. But in America, Ford was gone, and the vacuum he left was filled immediately. International Harvester's Farmall became the new standard. John Deere entered the market with the Model D, a two-cylinder monster that farmers loved. Alice Chalmers, Case, Oliver, Massey Harris, all of them rushed into the space Ford had abandoned. The tractor industry in America boomed through the 1930s, despite the Depression. Because tractors weren't luxury goods, they were necessities. Farms were getting bigger. Mechanization was accelerating. Horses were disappearing. By 1940, there were more tractors in America than draft horses. By 1950, horses on farms were essentially extinct. And all of it, traced back to the Fordson Model F, the little gray tractor that cost $230 and changed everything.
So here's the thing people forget. The Fordson didn't succeed because it was a good tractor. It succeeded because it was cheap, and that distinction matters. By any technical measure, the Fordson was mediocre. It was underpowered compared to its competitors. It was uncomfortable. It was dangerous. It had no meaningful advantages in design or engineering. What it had was price. And price, in mass markets, beats quality every single time. Ford understood this in a way his competitors didn't. He wasn't trying to build the best tractor, he was trying to build the cheapest tractor that still worked, and he succeeded. The Fordson was good enough, just barely good enough. But at $230, then $395, then $625, it was affordable to farmers who could never have bought a tractor otherwise. This strategy, by the way, is why Ford Motor Company exists today, and it's why most of Ford's competitors from the 1910s and 20s don't. Ford understood mass production, understood economies of scale, understood that if you can make something cheap enough, fast enough, you can dominate a market before anyone else figures out how to respond. The Fordson sold over 700,000 units between 1917 and 1928 in the U.S. alone. Add in production from Cork, and the total exceeds 750,000. No other tractor model even came close after World War II. And the impact? The impact was staggering. In 1920, American farms used over 25 million horses and mules. By 1950, that number had dropped to under 8 million. By 1960, under 4 million. The horse didn't just decline, it was erased, replaced by steel, gasoline, and the manufacturing efficiency Henry Ford pioneered. This had cascading effects. Farmland that had been used to grow hay and oats for horses was converted to cash crops. Food production per acre increased. Fewer workers were needed.
Small towns emptied. The American landscape fundamentally changed. And it wasn't just America. The Fordson was exported to every continent except Antarctica. It plowed fields in Canada, Australia, South Africa, India, Russia. After World War II, thousands of surplus Fordsons flooded European markets, accelerating mechanization there as well. In Russia, the Fordson became the basis for Soviet tractor production. In the 1920s, the Soviet Union purchased Fordsons by the thousands, then reverse-engineered them. The Fordson Putilovets, later redesigned as the Universal, was a direct copy. Soviet agriculture in the 1930s was mechanized largely with Fordson-derived tractors. So when you think about the industrialization of agriculture, when you think about how we went from subsistence farming to industrial farming in less than a century, the Fordson was the hinge. It was the machine that proved tractors could be cheap, simple, and mass-produced. It was the machine that killed the horse. And Henry Ford? He moved on, barely looked back. The tractor business for him was a solved problem. He'd proven it could be done, made his point, and left. Production of the original Fordson Model F ended in Cork in 1927, when Ford introduced an updated model, the Fordson N. The N fixed some of the Fordson's problems: better cooling, stronger transmission, slightly more power. But the basic design remained unchanged: lightweight, simple, cheap. Fordson production in Cork continued until 1933, when Ford moved tractor manufacturing to Dagenham, England. The Dagenham plant built Fordsons until 1964. Over 1 million Fordson tractors, all derived from Henry Ford's original 1917 design, were manufactured in Britain and Ireland. Today, original Fordson Model F tractors are collector's items. Restorations sell for $5,000, $10,000, sometimes $15,000. Enthusiasts love them, not because they're good tractors, but because they're historically significant. They represent a pivot point, the moment agriculture stopped being about animals and started being about machines. And if you ever get a chance to see one running, you should, because it's loud, it's crude, it vibrates, it smokes, it sounds like it's going to shake itself apart, and yet it works. It pulls a plow through dirt that would bog down a horse. It keeps running hour after hour as long as you keep fuel in the tank. That's the Fordson. Not elegant, not refined, but effective and cheap enough to change the world.